We are in the 27th table from ABCP, what the Brazilian thinks about foreign policy, o que os brasileiros pensam sobre a política externa. My name is Filipe Fernandes. I'm from the Federal University of ABC. I'm going to coordinate the table together with Feliciano, that is from Feliciano Guimarães, that is from the University of São Paulo. We are very glad to have Daniela Campello from Fundação Getúlio Vargas, that's going to present the paper Voter and Legislator Response to Localized Trade Shocks from China and Brazil. And Ana Carolina Raposo de Mello from University of São Paulo, that is going to present the paper Brazilian Foreign Policy on Twitter, Digital Expressions of Attitudes in the Early Months of Bolsonaro Administration. We are very glad to have Cameron Tyers from Arizona State University to make some comments, to have a very nice talk with us. I, Feliciano, and Ana, we are from the Brazil part of the LINE project that is collecting data from all Latin American on public opinion. And I think we have very nice information. We have very nice data to show to us, to everybody, to make some conversations about how foreign policy is going in Brazil since 2010. But right now I will give the word for Daniela, please.
Great. So how does that work, the presentation?
Vocês podem, meninas, você pode...
My remote control, yeah.
Pode compartilhar a apresentação dela e passar o controle remoto para ela, por favor.
Pronto, já estou fazendo compartilhamento.
Ivan, Cameron's last name is Thies.
Thies. Oh, so Cameron Thies.
Yeah. Daniela, só um disclaimer. Ele tem um delayzinho, então tome cuidado na hora que você na hora que você apertar o cursor, porque ele demora 1,5 segundos, 2 segundos para mudar de slide.
Deixa eu ver se eu...
A senhora já está com controle remoto, professora Daniela.
Tô, mas não está mexendo aqui não. Foi. Okay, so let me give you a little background on this research agenda. We are, as we were discussing before the panel started, we are trying to explore in this work something that I think it's still very overlooked in studying foreign policy and foreign preferences for foreign policy in Latin America and in Brazil, which is the fact that people are affected by shocks, by trade shocks, by FDI shocks in a local way. So we are trying to explore how these localized trade shocks affect individuals' responses to trade partners. So our case of that I'm talking about today is about China. So we want to know in this paper whether trade shocks that happen at the local level, if they influence the way citizens and legislators, their representatives, their views about integration with China in Brazil. So we want to know whether people that gained from trade with China respond more positively to China compared to people that lost from trade with China, who are in import competing sectors, or with our control group, which is most of the people in Brazil that never experienced either a trade shock or export shock or an import shock with China. So what do we do in our empirical strategy? We conducted a survey of public opinion in Brazil. We used data from a survey of legislators in Brazil, and we used data as well about local import and export shocks. So this data shows by Brazilian microregions, which is a very tiny, is a little bit more than a city, but far less than a state. So these microregions how much they suffered an import or an export shock from China. So our idea is that suffering import and export shocks from China will lead to different opinions about China. What do we find? We find that this is true. Actually, suffering trade shocks from China affects the views of residents and of representatives about China, but it only happens among losers from trade with China. So this is a very interesting thing. We find that people who live in places that suffered competition from China, they tend to view China more as a risk. And the representatives of these people, legislators, they tend to view China more as a risk. But those that benefited from trade with China, like in the center east, for example, of the country, in the agrarians, the agribusiness, they don't see China more as an opportunity than any other. So there is a response to China, to local shocks, but only among the losers from trade, which of course has implications for how we think about the relations between Brazil and China in the future. So what is the contribution of this paper to the literature? The first one is that it shows that interests matter. And there's a big turn in the literature about trade shocks and response to trade shocks and trade preferences into looking away from interest and looking into values and other characteristics of people that might determine how they see trade. And what this paper shows is that if we look into the people that really suffer in the shocks, we find that interests do matter the way that we can predict from theory. So this is, I find it interesting. At the same time, the other contribution is it's very rare that papers talk about representatives and people at the same time. Usually you have a long literature of a group of papers that deal with representatives, with the Congress, and lots of papers dealing with how people respond to trade, but never put them together. So our claim is that there's something special about localized trade shocks in Brazil that would lead us to expect that representatives do reflect the preferences of the people more than they do, for example, in the US, in which there's a big puzzle in the literature that very often legislators do not respond to trade shocks as their constituencies would prefer. Okay, so something about the trade shocks from China and Brazil. They are very intense and they occur along sectoral lines. So this first graph shows imports and exports from China. There was a huge increase in the past decade in trade from China. China went from the 12th partner of Brazil to top 1. So it was a big deal, it was a major change. It happened both in imports and exports. And something happened in parallel. There was a reduction of export similarity. So this graph shows basically that over time we started to export very different things from those we import from China. And that's basically a commodity for manufacture kind of trade. So we sell soy, meat, iron, and we import manufactured goods, technological goods, parts for industry as well. There's something also very interesting about the patterns of trade shocks from China in Brazil. They're very localized. So you have, and skewed, the distribution of these shocks is skewed. And what does that mean? That most of the localities in Brazil, they were unaffected by China. So in few localities were very affected. So you have if I would ask, we were talking about like the surveys and how people see China and Brazil, and they see China very favorably, the same way as they see other partners of Brazil. And I would say that part of it is the fact that most of the people are unaffected by China. Not directly, of course they are affected by China because it was fast economic growth, very related to China buying our exports in the past decade. But except for that, the direct effect of China in people's lives is very tiny. It doesn't exist in most of the cases. But in few places, like these red ones here, you had very strong export shocks in this case and import shocks in this other graph. So our intuition is that people would have a stronger opinion about China, or more informed opinion about China, would have spent some time thinking about China in those places, but not in the majority of the places in the country. So this is what we call localized trade shocks. Okay, and by the way, one interesting point why these shocks are localized in Brazil, and this is something that can be expanded to other countries in Latin America. In the US, shocks tend to be along factoral lines. There's a mobility of factors between sectors, And so the literature in the US recognizes that most of the shocks in the US are along factual lines, which means that workers tend to suffer positive shocks from trade, capital positive shocks from trade, and workers negative shocks from trade. So you have within a same political constituency, electoral constituency, you have business that wants something about trade, like that wants more trade, and labor that wants protection. Of course, it can be more complex than that, but the fact is you have within the same geographical constituency different interests. So in that sense, it makes sense to imagine that legislators are conflicted between the interests of the people and the interests of business that fund their campaigns. In the case of Brazil, these shocks they happen along factual lines, which means industry suffers a negative shock and agribusiness suffers a positive shock, and agribusiness and industry are very concentrated locally. So that's why there's something special about these localized trade shocks in Brazil, and it's the same thing in Argentina, and I would bet happens in other countries like that. So going back a little bit to the literature on open economic politics, so this idea of where does trade preferences come from? The idea of the open economic politics, which has been the driver of most of the theories about trade preferences until very recently, the idea is that interests form at the individual level. So people are affected individually by trade and they respond this way. So in some places it prevails the factory endowments model, which is, as I said, that trade shocks are suffered along factual lines, so business, labor, capital and labor. In some other places, when you have lower mobility of factors, people tend to experience the shocks along sectoral lines, so import shocks, export shocks, import competing sectors, exporting sectors. So it's about the sector of employment. So in this case here, in the first one, it depends on whether I am a worker or a skilled worker or a non-skilled worker. This will determine how I see trade and whether I'm negatively or positively affected by trade. In these other models here, it's about what's my industry? Do I work in the agribusiness? So if I'm in agribusiness and agribusiness is doing well, business is doing well and workers are doing well as well. So these are the two models that have been organizing the theory so far about trade preferences. The interesting thing is that there's weak support for either model, both in terms of legislators and both in terms of individuals. So we find the literature has very weak evidence that people respond as the way these theories predict. Okay, what's your story here? Let me just 1 second. That's so slow. Okay, so let me explain a little bit more. There are many different theories about how why would individuals not respond to trade shocks along these ways. One of them says that it's not about interests, it's about values. So if I'm a cosmopolitan person, I tend to like trade. Doesn't matter whether what is my position in the economy. I will be for trade because I'm a cosmopolitan person. I travel a lot. I'm for integration. There's some other theories that say that it's, for example, the one finding that's the strongest maybe in the literature is that the educated people tend to be pro-trade in the US, and that was used as a support for the factual model, is that educated people are trained in, they go to university, they're exposed to trade theories, and they tend to think that trade is positive just because they've learned this. So there's a big difference between people that go to university and people that don't go to university in the US. They tend to, those that go to university, be more pro-trade. So the literature, because of this, has moved into experience testing these values. So who is a xenophobic person tends to be against trade. Doesn't matter where this person is. So it's not about interests, it's about values. And in the case of legislators, there are lots of discussions about why legislators wouldn't respond to trade shocks the way the theories predict, and in a way that responds to the interests of their own constituencies. One reason is foreign policy. So maybe legislators care about foreign policy. They don't care about trade as an economic activity necessarily. For example, they care about China because of foreign policy issues and not because of the impact of trade in some specific places. Another possibility is that people simply don't know what are their interests. This both in the individual and the legislative level. Legislators just don't know what's best for their constituency. They are unaware of this. So there's a lot of literature, recent work on experiments trying to tell people where they are in this story to see whether that affects their responses to trade. But the fact is that there's very weak support for each model. And the literature is in a moment of soul searching, moving away from interest towards other factors. So what is our point about the geographically clustered trade shocks like they happen in the US? First of all, interests are not formed at the individual level, in a sense that people are not responding as factor of production or as employees in some specific sector. What happens when the shocks are localized is that they are felt in the locality. So they are felt by residents, regardless of the fact that these residents work in this specific industry or not. So if you have a shock in a city that was, for example, in the south of Brazil, that is dedicated to textiles, and suddenly there's competition from China, and there are like factories closing, business closing, there is an impact in the third sector in this region as well. So the cities feel the economic impact, and residents of the city, even if they don't work directly in a business that is affected by China, they will feel the effect of China. So our claim here in this paper is that interests are formed at the local level. We need to look at residents and not as to employees. The second thing is that we would expect, if the trade shocks are geographically clustered, that business and individual interests converge, because it's about sectors. So it's agribusiness on one side, industry on the other, and these sectors are, as I said, clustered geographically. So imagine again a city like Brusque, is a city of my husband in Santa Catarina, that was extremely dependent on textiles and suddenly experienced the competition from China. Business people were mad about China, and the workers were as well. So there's a chain of talking about China and news about China and complaining about competition from China that goes from business to people and people to residents, and it ends up spreading to the locality beyond simply the industry that people work. And we had this expectation also that loss aversion would matter in this case, that losers, this is something that is very established in the political psychology literature and in the trade literature, that people tend to, if you have exactly the same equivalent in loss and gains, people tend to react more negatively to this loss than they would have responded to exactly the same gain. So this is the concept, the notion of loss aversion. So we had from the beginning some expectations, especially because we had some pilot work before, that losers would be more responsive than winners from trades to China. So what did we do? So this is just China in the Brazilian news. Sometimes I need to show just to give you some taste of how China is in the news in Brazil, and usually is in the news when there's something bad to say about like closing competition and families that are suffering and cities that are experiencing decline in economic activity because of China, and it's localized. So there's some mention to Alho da China with the producers, some specific place. There's a Polo de Moda Barra do Prado, which is some very localized a place that experience competition from China. So this is the just to give you a flavor that this exists, this happens, and local media tends to report this kind of occurrence. So if a factory closes and there's competition from China, it's not unusual that you see in the news and you see policymakers and politicians blaming China for what's happening with these business and families. So what do we do? In the individual level, we run a national online survey that has 1,300 respondents. And we have three groups basically based on what we knew in terms of the shocks. One group that is municipalities or localities that experience strong export shocks, localities that experience strong import shocks, and our control group, which is localities that didn't experience any shock from China. And then we asked people the question, how much do you agree with the sentence? Stronger ties with China will bring more risk than opportunity to Brazil. And they could go from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And we controlled for many factors that seem to matter: income, education, ideology, so on and so forth. And our explanatory variable comes from Costa and others 2016, which is import and export shocks per worker at the local level, at the level of the microregion. So our sample is a sample of microregions, some that gained a lot, benefited a lot from China, some others that lost a lot because of China, and others that were unaffected. And we want to compare how people and representatives of these areas see China more as a risk or as an opportunity. The null hypothesis is just that people don't care, people don't know, they don't have information about China, so it doesn't matter. So we should see no effect at all. And this, I'm not sure if you can see that well, but this is the probability, the probability of you have the ever marginal effects of import shocks. So what's the probability that people respond, that they strongly agree that China is more of a risk than an opportunity, depending on the level of shocks? And what we find is that you have people tend, when you have strong import shocks, the probability that people agree with the question that China is a risk and not an opportunity gets very high. And they tend to reduce the probability that people disagree that China is a risk. And these effects are statistically significant. So there's some effect. People tend to agree more that China is a risk and disagree more that China is a risk, is not a risk when there is import shocks, very strong import shocks. Export shocks, as you can see, this is the line of the zero effect. There's absolutely no effect. So if individuals experience strong export shocks from China, they benefit from trade with China. They don't tend to see China less as a risk than other individuals in the control group.
It's a big difference.
Yeah, big difference. So and it's interesting because it goes exactly the same direction in the legislators, which is an unusual result in the literature. So sector occupation is never relevant. So we control for sector of occupation. So think about that. If you have one resident in a losing area, even if this resident is in a winning sector, it tends to respond as a resident. So people tend to respond as residents. So sector of occupation never matters. And education actually decreases the view of China as a risk, which is exactly the opposite that you would expect in a country that has abundant non-skilled labor and restricted skilled labor. You would expect that more skilled labor would be more against China, and they tend to see China as beneficial to Brazil. So it fits like this attitude hypothesis that education is not about factor when the factor endowment has to do with attitudes. Then we ask exactly the same question in Congress. So what we do is that we have like the micro regions. We weight the votes of of legislators per micro region to have some idea where they're strong and weaker, and how they, assuming that they're going to be more influenced by the micro regions that voted more for them. We use the Brazilian Legislative Survey from Duke Power 2019, 248 legislators. Again, this is not a representative sample of the Brazilian Congress, but this is not what we care about, as our sample was not a representative sample of Brazil. We wanted a sample in which the variable of interest that we cared about, the shocks, varied. That's the most important thing. So that's what we made sure to have in the national survey, and this is what we managed to have in the survey. There was variation among the legislators that were from import competing areas and for exporting areas. And we looked also at the probability of legislators entering the Brazilian-China caucus, which is supposed to be a caucus that promotes trade between and economic activity between China and Brazil. And we looked into the speeches. So we did a content analysis of speeches of politicians about China, which is actually very funny because one of the people that spoke the most about China was Bolsonaro about the nióbio. And it seems that his thing, anti-China sentiment, is it comes from a very long time ago. And we control by ideology, income and party and all that. And again, explanatory variable is exactly the same shocks, but aggregated by the constituency level. And what we find again is that there is a positive effect on people agreeing that China is a risk, legislators agreeing that China is a risk when they are representatives of regions that had suffered strong import shocks. So they tend to see China more as a risk. And there's absolutely no effect, again, when export shocks. So legislators from areas that benefited from trade with China don't tend to see China more as an opportunity. This is probability of being in the China-Brazil caucus with import shocks. which means that those who enter the China-Brazil caucus are actually the ones that experience shocks and are more anti-China, which is an interesting thing. And the second is the probability of anti-China speeches, like that fits perfectly. The people that go and speak out against China tend to come from regions that lost from China. And we don't find this effect. People that come to speak in favor of China are not those that come from areas benefited from China, so that there is no variation with benefits. So what do we conclude? That interests do matter for trade preferences, but they are formed at the local, not strictly individual level. So what's the point of the story is to say, and there's some critique, that interests defined by the open economy politics are very strict. So people not necessarily respond to their own situation, but they may respond, especially when the shocks are localized and they affect their whole cities, they respond as residents. So it doesn't matter where they work, they tend to respond the same way just because they live in this place that experienced a negative shock from China. Losers are aware and respond to trade shocks, so they tend to see China more as a risk, but winners not. And the interesting thing is, and this is why we insisted on publishing this piece together, the business and individuals, and we heard from many reviewers that we should write 2 papers, is that we have exactly the same shocks, and the convergence of interest enters the legislative agenda. So we see legislators responding exactly the same way as people respond to the shock. So the winners don't care, and the losers tend to react to China. So the implications are the absence of compensation. Losers should be the ones to lead the protectionist agenda in Brazil. Just to finish, so I think that there's a lot to learn from this to what is happening right now in Brazil with China, and we're gonna probably talk about that in the Q&A. But the fact that we see now industrialists, I always like to point out the industrial, the business guys from industry that work with Bolsonaro in the Supreme Court with Toffoli. If you check like where they are from, it's exactly all the sectors that lost from China. They went there to say that we should open the open up business again because there was competition from China. So industry has been very vocal against China in Brazil. So of course there is Bolsonaro that doesn't like China for whatever ideological reasons, but there's very clear interest behind this agenda of the government, to this anti-China sentiment of Bolsonaro government. On the other side, if you see agribusiness, and I've been like watching lots of webinars about how the agribusiness deals with foreign policy and how they're responding to this anti-China sentiment, and they're not responding at all. They're making loads of money because of the exchange rate. They're very prosperous at this moment, and they just don't react to the anti-China sentiment of the industrialists. And if you ask why I think they do so, because they think that China is pragmatic and they're good and they have comparative advantage, and China will keep on buying from them, which is something that might be true, might not be true. I think that the 5G would be a turning point in this aspect, but I really want to do more on this agenda. So any suggestions? We want to look into campaign financing. We looked into voting, patterns of voting, and we found that losers from China were more probably voted for Bolsonaro, which is something interesting going on, and looking into investment as well. So with that, I finish. Maybe long presentation.
Thanks a lot, Daniela. It's a very interesting piece, and I think we have to talk a lot about it, and it's a very timely issue. And now I give the word for Anna, please.
Thank you all. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks, Feliciano, Daniela, Eva, and Cameron. I just wanted to know if the presentation will be accessible. I guess Lais is going, yeah, thank you. All right, so back in 2018, prior to the election, we began to see a lot of talk about social media influencing people's thoughts and politics, voter behavior, public manifestations on the streets, and we began to see people talking about foreign policy online. So I eventually decided to take a look at this and see if it was a thing, because I had been, in touch with the work from Las Américas and the recent literature on public opinion and foreign policy. And sorry guys, I don't know if you can hear me right, but there's a sort of a noise.
Yeah. Daniela was typing, and then we could hear her typing.
Oh, okay, sorry. So we began monitoring Twitter and, to see what was happening in terms of foreign policy. And luckily, we came across very, very interesting things. The first of them being a tweet by Minister Ernesto Araújo before he was actually, before he stepped in office. He tweeted more than 100,000 followers on Twitter and 47,000 supportive likes in the latest tweet, figures that demonstrate how interested Brazilians are in Bolsonaro's foreign policy. This attention to international relations brings the population closer to Itamaraty, a radical novelty to be celebrated. So I looked at that and said, well, we may be onto something here, because as you know, traditionally, public opinion on foreign policy was regarded as practically inexistent, non-coherent, until, I guess, very recently, I'm talking about 15 years ago, where a more robust agenda, including the Las Américas project, began to show that, yeah, people do think about foreign policy, even if they don't put it in those terms. They express their attitudes, they have their opinions, regardless of their level of information, which is something very interesting. But even among, well, that specific literature that was beginning to show that, yeah, foreign policy may not have the same space or occupy the same dimension in the public debate as other public issues, people do talk about it. The sources of public opinion information were not looking at social media. And as we saw, social media began in the past few years to impact the way people vote, the way people manifest in so many areas of the public debate on politics in general. So it was only pertinent to see whether we could look to social media to see if people were talking about it and whether it would capture internet users' opinions. So I decided to monitor Twitter, and let me change here. Well, yeah, this is what I just said, I'm sorry. So the minister's reference to a radical novelty, well, it actually is not such a radical novelty. As I was saying, people were talking about how Brazilians engage in foreign policy issues. So we began monitoring Twitter, working with the hypothesis that maybe social media would work as a shortcut between elites with information and with attitudes on foreign policy issues. They would transfer their opinions and their views to a more general, uninformed public. So until recently, what we see as consolidated in public opinion information about foreign policy, given the nature of information gap between those who actually hold the information and those who receive it, we saw leader speeches and the media as the main factors, as the main vessels of information and attitude transference. But social media came in a very particular place, in a very different from traditional media, in the sense that they allegedly provide a platform, but they're not so neutral. The type of interaction will depend on the affordances you get, affordances being the capacities and the characteristics of each social media. So anyway, we began to see that leaders were using social media to engage allegedly directly. We know that this unmediated communications not so unmediated, because platforms engage people and motivate certain behavior that is not exactly neutral, but still it was not information going through a media outlet. It was a post seen directly by a leader's followers. So this had the possibility of changing the way leaders and politicians relate to their constituencies, to the public in general. So I decided to monitor Twitter because for two reasons, actually. One, because it's research friendly, its API is a lot more accessible, and it's easier to obtain data and to see an open debate. But most of all, and this is not being a technical issue, but rather a phenomenon that puts each social media in a certain role, Twitter is more like a public square. It's became known to be a political media, a political platform. Leaders are there, journalists are there, people who form opinion are there, essentially, and the themes being discussed in the platform are concerning the public debate, not necessarily political, but it tends to be less personalized. People tend to express their views on intimate and non-public issues much less than in other platforms. So Twitter's being, and this is quite established in the literature for the past few years, Twitter has consolidated as a political platform. Political not in the partisan sense only, but in the sense that people talk about public stuff, basically. So how to monitor foreign policy in that huge debate, and where people talk about everything from, Korean pop bands to I don't know, last episode of whatever series, through themes and not authors. There are very good works monitoring authors, but I sensed a lack of theme monitoring, meaning we had to locate the debate outside the traditional network. We had to see whether those foreign policy issues would appear in the whole of the conversation. So from using software Netlytic, I monitored from April 2nd to June 2nd, so 2 months early in Bolsonaro's administration, reaching 10 selected foreign policy issues. Sorry. Oh my God, what did I do? Confusion, sorry. I'm gonna go back to the start and do it all over again. This is.
You have to be very careful when you press the arrow. It jumps very quickly. So you press the arrow and you wait 1 second.
Okay, so I have to be patient. I'm sorry.
Yeah. There is this delay because the presentation is with the administration. It's not with you.
Okay. Well, we'll get there.
One more.
Okay, no, that's it. So monitoring through Netlytic, we reached a set of 10 foreign policy issues that would need to be monitored. Those foreign policy issues were oriented mainly by the Las Américas survey. So I extracted themes that the survey asked respondents. So they asked about the relationship between Brazil and the United States, Brazil's position in Latin America, how respondents felt about the UN. So I built up some search parameters to reflect the talk on those themes, obviously excluding any sort of overlap that had word coincidence but did not refer to foreign policy. For instance, in Brazil, we had years ago a football tournament called Copa Mercosul, So as I monitored Mercosul, many tweets on Copa Mercosul emerged. I guess this was something that was expected, so we had to control that sort of overlap. So in the end, after monitoring and selecting, we reached 750, a little bit more than that, tweets about foreign policy in these 2 months. Also in these 2 months, in order to know whether this number is relevant or not, we had 2 internet monitoring services, one from FGV, the DAPP, from FGV, saying that foreign policy that semester had been among the top 10 issues commented on the internet, and also USP's Monitor do Debate Político Digital, Political Debate Digital Monitor, I guess I would translate it like that, saying that foreign policy issues were being emergent in the overall debate. I didn't have the means to do this sort of monitoring in comparison, but I had the support of these 2 institutions to calibrate the results. And also I monitored hashtags and saw foreign policy issues in hashtags, which was something that has meaning in the sense that foreign policy issues were, at least for brief moments, up in the debate. So what were those themes extracted from Las Americas? The issues were United States, Israel, Venezuela, global warming, China, the IMF, regional integration, and in many of its expressions, such as UNASUL, Mercosul, the regional integration project called ProSul, which at the time was hitting the trending topics, the Ministry of Foreign Relations, the United Nations, and the Organization of American States, which did not produce any relevant results at the time. We saw that issues that had been associated with real life events, foreign policy events, such as the president's trips to the United States, the president's trip to Israel, and the attempt to change the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, were more engaging. People tweeted more about those issues, while other issues, they had an ongoing conversation, but they were not hitting. So either way, the debate had enormous concentration, meaning what we see here as RTs correspond. Well, I'm sorry, I have to make a parenthesis here. This is a working paper. I have to improve data visualization hugely, but this is what I could get up until this point, so I'm sorry. But I hope we can understand from this very simple table that those top 10 engaging tweets from all universe of tweets involving the relationship between Brazil and the United States, only 10 tweets were retweeted so much that they made up 30% of the debate, meaning original tweets that actually are diffused are very, very few. And you have thousands of tweets that are barely seen by anyone. So there is a concentration of the debate. There is a non-horizontal diffusion of information, much like it operates in the traditional media cascade, for instance. There are holders of the way the speech is formulated and many, many listeners or people who interact with that formulation. So the concentration is very high, even at its lowest for instance, China or Venezuela, it is still very high. We're talking about 10 tweets that correspond to more than 20% of the debate. In other issues that we have very few people talking about, people just retweet. So we have global warming with 93%, which was something I checked and rechecked, and it was it, which is quite amazing. I mean, I don't see an immediate explanation for that, but there's the hypothesis that fewer people are talking about it, and it wasn't something at the top of the public debate at that moment, but something that's worth looking at. So people can engage with tweets through likes and replies, and this is also a measurement of engagement, not only the number of retweets making up the debate. So a tweet reaches a great many users, and those users may not have been looking at foreign policy issues in the paper, for instance. And also, I tried to look at who was tweeting those top 10 engaging tweets, who were the responsible actors, yeah, thank you, in the debate, who was speaking, actually. So this was very interesting. So one of the most curious discoveries in this, first entry in the field was finding out that, yes, still politicians were leading the debate. Yes, journalists played a great part, but more than ambassadors, more than official ministry profiles, we had outsiders and internet influencers dominating the debate as well, very closely to journalists. So by outsiders, I mean people who are not from the so-called foreign policy community. So we have people who might have some degree of fame, let's say a doctor, a biological researcher, a TV presenter, meaning people who have notoriety outside internet, but are not related to the foreign policy community at all. And they were talking about foreign policy issues, and they were being retweeted in a very, very large scale. And you also have internet influencers who are people who have not built notoriety or fame outside their internet interactions or attitudes, or they actually work as information diffusers in the internet. So that's why I divided those two categories of actors. One of them being outsiders, meaning they have notoriety besides their online presence, and internet influencers, they practically made up themselves from being on the internet. And they were talking about foreign policy. Filipe, which is a very prominent internet influencer right now in Brazil, was talking about foreign policy issues.
And Time magazine put him in the top 100 most influential people in the world, right? Filipe Neto.
Yeah, exactly. And suddenly he was talking about things that maybe we didn't have famous people talking about. We didn't have so prominent people talking about, or at least the literature thought that the main source of information would be the traditional media, that would be the people with access to a very limited and asymmetrical dynamics of informational change. So this was very interesting to learn, and it opened up a whole field of possibilities Some of them I'm exploring right now in the PhD, but we realized that the outward diffusion of elite's perception is now mediated also by social media. They have become an autonomous element when people form their foreign policy preference, because they are one of the means of communication and possibly one of the main sources of information people have nowadays. So maybe if people are not on Twitter, Twitter is a very much like a little soundbox. It affects other media. It spreads throughout the environment of social media, made up of Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, Telegram, so on and so forth. And it also reaches traditional media. Whenever President Bolsonaro tweets something, whenever President Trump tweets something, newspapers talk about it. So it produces its own phenomena. And due to their particular influence follower dynamics, social media have become a power vessel of attitude transference, not only information transmission, but attitude transference, because tweets are essentially opinionated. I hate this word, but how can I say they express opinion? They're very rarely just informative. You find informative tweets on traditional media profiles, and that's it. Even journalists, even well, there's always some commentary. The concentration of the debate around notable influencers, as well as their ability to mobilize attitude expression in a large community of users, indicated that Twitter was used as an instrument for attitude transference. This occurred as a large community of potentially uninformed users replicated the messages, appropriating their content. So in face of informational disadvantage, those users relies on Twitter's endogenous elites, on people they followed, on people they trusted, on people they tend to listen to whenever it comes to any other aspect of the public debate. So why not follow and endorse and retweet and engage with a commentary on foreign policy? So it captures the user's attention, and maybe this has amplified the exposure of foreign policy issues in the domestic arena. We're not sure whether this is measurable in terms of, has this increased salience of foreign policy? Has it enlarged the democratic cost of foreign policy in Brazil, which is traditionally low? It's still unknown, but we know that people are being exposed to foreign policy on social media, and people who are who don't follow the social media community, the foreign policy community, are still being exposed because people outside this foreign policy community are talking about foreign policy issues. And we also know, and there's something to be further explored also, maybe in the near future, the foreign policy issues, when they're treated, they express attitudes. And social media, maybe it can capture attitudes that are not necessarily captured in surveys like ours in Las Américas. Maybe we can see things and realize things from the general public, from the elites, and from this relationship that surveys might not capture. So it's an interesting adventure, monitoring social media for foreign policy issues. That's it. I thank you very much and look forward for your questions.
Thanks a lot, Anna. It was very nice presentation, very nice findings about how Twitter can affect our foreign policy, or tweeting are being a platform where some part of our foreign policy are happening. And now I want to give the word for Cameron Thies to make some comments. Please, Cameron, feel free.
All right. Well, thank you very much again for inviting me to be part of this panel. I got to read some very interesting papers and learn a lot about Brazilian foreign policy, so it was definitely worth it. I think I'll just give my comments in the order of the two presentations. So I'll start with Daniela's paper first. And Daniela, please say hi to Francisco. I got to know your co-author a bit a few years ago when I spent some time with him and his colleagues in Chile. So I was glad to see that you two
that's cool.
are working together. Okay, so first of all, I would say the paper has a really nice setup. So your paper does a great job of detailing how scholars have basically so far failed to demonstrate that self-interest drives individuals' views on trade, which of course challenges, as you say, one of the tenets of the open economy politics paradigm. Right, but you go on and you try to save us, right? You try to give us a potential connection by arguing that when trade shocks are localized, self-interest is determined by income shocks at the local level. And it's not just individuals working in the affected industry, but it spreads to other residents, right? And so since the effect is localized, it also likely shapes the representatives' views on international trade. So I think this is really a really interesting move, and I think one that will be welcome in the literature for sure, because as you say, this has been really kind of a conundrum in the literature for some time. Now, one of the things that I don't know, this doesn't bother me, but I was trying to think about, when, I don't know if you've sent this paper out for review yet or not, but one...
Yeah, actually it was accepted between my,
oh, good.
my last version and now.
So the one thing I was worried about was sort of a lack of novel theorizing. That some of the journals, you might run into people complaining about that, but I actually didn't think that was a big issue at all. But since it's already been accepted, obviously it wasn't a big issue, right? The thing that the logic makes sense, you're sort of relying on, well, other strands of the existing literature have moved away from that kind of narrow self-interest, so we're going to do that too. And I think that the empirical results are so compelling, I'm not surprised that it's accepted. Right? So that makes total sense. Yeah, and again, the findings are fascinating, right? A couple of sort of questions for you maybe to think about, and I don't really have.
Let me tell you that this is an open agenda for research, so keep criticizing and asking, because there are going to be more pieces on that.
Well, one of the things I was thinking about, in sort of discussing this growth of Chinese-Brazilian trade, you really point out that the two have established this kind of commodity for manufactured trades that reminds us of the core periphery relations, as you say, discussed by dependency theorists. You also, mention again prospect theory's notion of how sensitive you are when you're in the domain of losses. So I'm wondering, how much of the findings might be unique to this type of unequal trade that kind of invokes those historical analogies and those kind of psychological sensitivities. Or do you think that your findings may generalize to other forms of trading relationships, like intra-industry trade, right, where you're trading similar products, rather than that kind of unequal trade that, historically, I think gets everyone, right? We don't want to be caught in that kind of neo-colonial relationship. So I would be curious to see how that works elsewhere, if people pick up on this and apply it in other contexts. Another thing I was wondering about was sort of, measuring the impact of trade shocks and the time relationship to the public opinion survey. So as I understood from the paper, you had a 2010 estimate of the trade shocks, and then the public opinion survey for the sort of individuals, the masses, was 2018. So I wondered if you had sort of thought about sort of, I guess, maybe individuals' time sensitivity to these shocks, like how long do they last, right? Is it possible that people maybe remember the bad things more than they remember the good things, right, in a shock? I don't know about the dynamics of the time, the temporal relationship here, but that would be something interesting to explore too. for the legislatures, I really liked the use of the 3 different forms of evidence, the surveys, the caucus membership, and the speeches. I thought that was fantastic. I always like multiple sources of evidence, and I think that really nailed it. So I guess I'm not surprised this paper was already accepted, because basically my last sort of sentence was, I think the paper is ready to send out for review. So, so congratulations on the acceptance, because I really didn't have much to critique about it. I mostly just started wondering, about these bigger questions about the form of trade and how long these trade shocks persist that could be interesting to explore down the road in other work. So congratulations, it's a great paper.
Thanks.
Okay.
Can I answer now, or should I wait for?
I don't know.
I think we should wait for all the comments, and
Okay.
after that you can answer, Daniela.
Okay. All right, so then I'll move on to Anna's paper, which I thought was nice. It started with a very thorough review of the literature on the sources of Brazilian foreign policy, with a focus on the role of public opinion. So I learned a lot from this paper. So thanks so much for that. It was really interesting to me that debates about public opinion and foreign policy in Brazil and the US are very similar, right? They sort of start out with this belief that public opinion is sort of random on foreign policy. There's nothing stable about it. Then they move to the belief that there might be some stability and consistency driven largely by the elites who work through the mass media. And now we're all sort of reconsidering sort of mass opinion's role, at least in part because of the advent of social media. So I thought that's really interesting. And I wonder if that's just because the US and Brazil are such large countries that have traditionally had foreign policy controlled by kind of a small elite, or if this is maybe a more general phenomenon we see. I just don't know enough about public opinion to know, but I thought that was really kind of interesting, the kind of similarities there. I thought you made a really good case for studying social media in the paper, since there's, we're getting more and more literature on this. And as you say, there's not a lot of literature yet on the Brazilian case. And it does seem a priori plausible that platforms like Twitter provide this two-way connection between elites and producers of formal news content with the mass public as consumers and reactors to that content. So I think that's kind of an interesting setup. Now, one thing that seemed to be missing at the end was that there wasn't a return to the two-way part, right? It seemed to be mostly operating like traditional media as a way to disseminate attitudes from traditional elites and sort of the endogenous elites to others, right? So I'm curious if there's a way at some point to find out if there's a feedback mechanism, right? Because that seems to be one thing that social media really offers that traditional media doesn't offer, right? Is the feedback mechanism. So if you can figure out a way to do that, that would be pretty cool, right? Let's see. The findings again in this paper I think are very interesting. I mean, I think I was really surprised to find out how just a few original tweets really dominate sort of the Twitter traffic on these foreign policy issues. I don't think I'd ever seen anybody do that kind of analysis before. So I thought that was very interesting. I did want to know more about the group of endogenous Twitter elites. I mean, you talked a little more about it in your presentation, I think that was in the paper. But, even looking at the list of like, that you had up on that table, most of those people look like traditional elites to me, save for a couple of those categories. Even, embassies tweeting well, embassies are staffed by traditional elites, right? I mean, so I'm curious about those endogenous elites, and maybe you could have a little more discussion in the paper about who they are. Like Feliciano mentioned, the person that's on the Times 100 influential list, something like that, I think would help your reader understand a little more about who this other group of elites are. And also how distant or independent of the traditional elites they are. I think that's the other thing that would be helpful too. It sounds like they are independent, but it would be nice to have a little more documentation on that. It's the last thing I was thinking, you know, I have a paper with Jean-Christophe Boucher where we were looking at Trump's tweeting on steel and aluminum tariffs. And one of the things we did was look at the social network that's generated by the retweeting activity. And one of the things we found is this very much a series of echo chambers, right? When people are retweeting, it's picked up by other people similar to them. And I'm curious if you find the same phenomena in Brazil on foreign policy, if you know, I'm seeing tweets from people who are like me and I retweet it to other people and it's picked up by other people like me, or if you see anything that's crossing kind of partisan divides or I don't know, different social groups of whatever sort. That would be kind of interesting to see in future work too. So overall, another really super interesting paper that taught me a lot about Brazilian public opinion and the role of social media. So thank you for that paper. Thank you both for the privilege of reading two really interesting papers.
Thanks a lot, Cameron. Feliciano, if you have some words to say, some comments, please feel free. And after that, we give back for the presentators. Or I don't know if Anna and Daniela, if you prefer to receive more comments from the broad audience. We have a lot of people, very intelligent and nice people here that can make some comments. But Feliciano, please have the word.
Thank you, Ivan. Thank you, Daniela, Anna, for the presentation, Cameron for the very good comments, as always. First of all, Daniela's paper is an amazing paper, awesome presentation, defining. I'm very happy that it got accepted. It's a paper that is going to be, for sure, very much read and quoted in this debate. So I think I don't have much to say about the paper, the inside of the paper and like how the paper was built and everything. So I have two speculations about your research agenda that I think it could be interesting, very interesting. First is the micro foundation of the residents' perception, right? Because what is very interesting about your finding is that you're showing that at the local level, the micro local level, it's what matters it matters more than if the person is a worker or the owner of the company, right? If the whole community is affected by the external shock, so this person will change its perception positively or negatively towards China. So trying to understand how these residents build these mechanisms of perception against or in favor of China will be an interesting agenda. I don't know how we could produce that because it's a huge country with so many different states and micro regions, but that will be very interesting for us, especially for us who try to understand the perception of Brazilian attitudes towards foreign policy in general. So he's trying to understand the mechanisms of perception. It's a very interesting agenda. So this finding, your finding will open up this sort of research agenda. And secondly, I think it's the general finding that the losers complain and the winners don't complain, right? The ones that are winning from China in the agribusiness sector are not there in Brasilia trying to change or even protect China against Bolsonaro's fierceful anti-China establishment, right? In the other hand, you have the losers, which is probably the industry of São Paulo, Santa Catarina. They are there in Brasilia trying to force. So this will be a very interesting research agenda based on your findings and how to understand how these actors are pressuring Brasilia, doing some lobbying in Brasilia to understand according to their interests, right? We more or less know from Munker Olson that the ones who are going to lose are usually more vocal than the ones who are winning. I think your finding goes into that direction, but the political implications of the finding will be very interesting. I think we exchanged a couple of emails about that, and it will be very interesting to know. So these are just my two general comments for your paper. It's a great paper, amazing. About Anna, well, we've been working together. I really like her research agenda. Now in her PhD, she's trying to explore these findings that she found in her dissertation. These are the findings that of her dissertation, master's dissertation. In Brazil, master and PhD are separate. So you first finish your master and then you apply for your PhD. So she just started her PhD. And I think the most, as Cameron said, the most interesting thing for her now will be these two things that Cameron said. First, trying to understand the feedback process. I think this is how other actors, especially the big media, react to social media, and how the social media more or less influences Brazilian general attitudes. That's a very difficult feedback to build, to understand empirically, but that's a research agenda open. In a second research agenda, then I think it's also very interesting, and it's something that we're doing together with Anna now in another paper, which is trying to characterize the network patterns of these retweets and the networks of supporter, right? She divided in big types of general types of elites, and Cameron is correct in assessing that she needs to go further down that road and trying to disentangle these big groups into a more nuanced characterization, and trying to understand how these different groups in social media, based on the most on the subjects that and the most concentrated subject is the United States, China, Venezuela, who are them and what they are talking about and how they build up their networks on the internet. So that will be another research agenda different from the feedback one. And I think she's open for both of them in the PhD that she's starting now. So these are my general comments, and thank you very much for the papers and for Cameron comments again.
Nice, Feliciano. I will send the word for Daniela to respond for the comments of Cameron and Feliciano. And if somebody wants to make a comment from the audience, please give the information on the chat, and I will give you the word. Please, Daniela.
So thank you so much for the comments. It's as I said, it's an open agenda. It's a funny thing because I started this work kind of. I was not exactly focused on the relations between U.S. and China, but after we started working on this piece, now it's in the top of my research agenda is trying to understand this anti-China sentiment in Brazilian foreign policy and the effects of so exactly how Feliciano said, how these things that we found explain what's going on right now in Brazil. Because as they mentioned, like if you look at like the survey of how Brazilians feel about China, this anti-China sentiment is not there at all. So it comes from somewhere. I don't think it's completely, many things are crazy right now in Brazil, so you can just attribute to craziness of the foreign policy makers. But I think there may be more things than that, and this process of how these guys from industry are in Brasilia and how agribusiness seems to it's not about me and pretend there's nothing happening. So it's a very interesting thing. So how the specific findings apply to other types of trade things, I think it's something specific to this kind of trade, and not only because I think that there's some reaction, some pride in saying like I don't want to do like commodity for manufacturing because it's like a colony core periphery kind of thing, but I think it's because of the localized nature of the shocks. Most of if you think about I'm thinking of the case that I know better, which is Argentina. There's some pieces on Argentina from Vicky Murillo and others. What they show is that they have this commodity for manufacture with China too, and I suspect that most of the region has as well. And commodity producers, they're usually clustered, right? It's a natural thing to have agriculture in some part of the country and not spread out. Like if you have like countries that have import and export industrial products, it's all spread out across the country. We tend to have this more localized. So I suspect that we may find whole localities affected as well in other countries in Latin America. So I think it's there's something about the ideology of the thing, like the concern for deindustrialization that was a topic of discussion in Brazil, but also the fact that the shocks are clustered. They are local and people feel them in their lives. It's not about like one job, one industry. It's like a whole city feeling this impact. So it's easier to make this salient to the people. People don't know that much about these issues and what they think about Israel, but when they suffer, then it becomes very, very salient. So I think there's more to be explored, not everywhere, but I think in Latin America, definitely. The temporal relationship, that's a great question. This paper was published with the shocks like a few years ago. It's like how things work, right? The last data was 2010, but it was published in 2016, 15. But the thing is, the commodity boom, what we experienced, we have reasons to think that whatever they measured in 2010 kept happening for at least 4 or 5 more years. We still have like China buying a lot from Brazil. It's still the first partner and still commodity for manufacturers. So there are reasons to think that these patterns still apply. I don't think it's about memory. It's about like they're still experiencing losses and competition and the good things in agribusiness too. Right now, agribusiness is doing well, as it was almost in the peak of the commodity boom, because the prices went up and the Brazilian currency devalued. So I think the dynamics remain the same, but still I think it's a definitely reasonable question whether people are still feeling this or not. So Feliciano, the macro foundations, again, this is exactly what I'm interested in right now to go to check. First of all, one question that we got from the reviewers was, okay, there's a connection between what people want and what the legislators want, how they respond, but what is exactly the connection? And my intuition, we don't have data in this paper to talk about this, but my intuition is that it goes from business to the people and from business to legislators. So factories close or lose the fire people, and there is something from the administration to the people, to workers, say, like, we're firing people and it's justified on China. And then this is the spread. And I believe that for legislators, the same thing. It's less about economic voting and it's more about funding, campaign funding. And I'm pretty sure that these legislators are funded by companies that are being affected by China. And so this is one step that we want to make. And this issue on how legislators, was one of the things that reviewers insisted on us, is whether legislators matter or not for foreign policy. And we know that they don't. Not much, right? They can't be gatekeepers. So this is one thing that matters. They can, as we know, the legislators don't remain legislators their whole careers, like in the US. So they become governors, then they become mayors. And there's some connection between the funding legislators and opening possibilities for business. Let's put it this way. Some published papers on this. So trying to understand how these mechanisms are happening. This is like my goal for the next few years in this agenda. So anyhow, I think that the Twitter thing I really enjoy, because I think that in particular I like this idea that there are many groups talking about this, and I would love to know more about the content, because everything is so polarized. You certainly find some polarization on that too. And I'm very curious about how this idea that the China virus and why Olavo de Carvalho is so crazy about, the guru of Bolsonaro is so crazy about China, where it comes from, because I think the interests are there, but there is some combination of interest and ideology and prejudice. I don't know, that I think it's very interesting to tease what is going on. So anyway, we have lots of opportunities to talk about this in the future, and we eventually work together. That's it.
Thanks a lot, Daniela. Anna, please feel free to respond to comments.
Well, thank you so much for comments, Cameron and Feliciano. Well, Daniela, I heard you speak, and the first thing I wanted to do after we hung up was to dive in the China database and see what's there, because I mean.
No, I saw the paper, your paper, and I thought exactly the same thing. We have to check this.
Yeah, and there's probably something going on. Me and Feliciano just did this on tweets regarding globalism, and we saw some very interesting things. So this in this non-general, this theme-specific analysis can be really revealing, I guess. So there is a lot to be explored. That is a lot to be further developed. Feedback mechanism is something that is being studied in many other areas of public policy in terms of, legislators have their own teams for monitoring social media. The presidency certainly has its teams for monitoring social media, and there's indication. I mean, I've read things not in scholarly papers, but there are independent survey companies that do those kinds of reports, and they measure, for instance, recoils or advances depending on social media reaction. So this is something that could be explored, and it's fantastic, really, to see that, you know, there's an immediate measurement. But also the problem here is engagement is so largely made of cognitive shortcuts. You know, the debate is so much, so concentrated that are you really getting people's opinions in terms of policy consistently? That's why we've been monitoring, you know, a larger period of time, because this has to be answered. And, you know, the immediate response might not reflect an actual reaction to policy. So maybe a collective of punctual responses, a larger analysis. I don't know, it's something that has to take into consideration an authentic behavior, groups pushing messages through bots or fake accounts. So if they're doing so with foreign policy issues, what does it mean? Why are groups interested in pushing upwards foreign policy issues? It says something, and, you know, many questions to be answered. So yes, I know there's a lot of work still to be done, and by no means what this initial attempt resolves 1/10 of the questions. So yeah, who are those endogenous elites? I will certainly explore that more deeply in the paper, because there is a difference, especially in Brazil, in terms of a famous person that talks about soccer or art or whatever, a famous person that talks about politics and crosses the line. But foreign policy is something difficult to find in those, historically difficult to find in those very public figures that are not from the foreign policy community. And to see that was something quite outstanding, I guess. But also those people who haven't had any actual role in a non-digital life, and they suddenly made huge audiences out of their online actions, out of their online presence. The fact that those people reach unusual audiences, different from those of traditional papers, different from those of news broadcasting on TV, on the radio, and they're talking about foreign policy issues, even if it's once every 2 weeks there's a tweet on foreign policy. Still, it's getting there. It's setting a little bit the agenda. And about the echo chambers, well, those I looked at those, the most engaging tweets. I read them, and I wondered how were they calibrated, which words they used, what were they expressing. And it's I didn't have a large N at that time to attest that, but a first impression, and that's probably why the influence dynamics is not so much explored in the paper, but I hope to further explore it. It seemed like foreign policy attitudes were deeply connected to the position or the stance the user had in domestic politics. So whether you're positioned in the right, whether you're positioned in the left, this would affect your stance on a foreign policy issue. So particularly Bolsonaro's foreign policy is very mobilizing, is very engaging in terms of identity, in terms of it is one of the issues that people identify with in order to show that they are pro or against the government. So it's alongside education, institutional relations with science, is alongside environmental issues. We suddenly have foreign policy in the front lines of a narrative battle, and this is this calls attention, to say the least. So yes, there's so much to do. Well, thank you so much. That's it, I guess.
Thanks a lot, Ana. I want to give the word for Leticia Pinheiro. I think that if anybody wants to make many other comments, please feel free to say for us on the chat, and I will give the word. Please, Leticia.
Hi, hello, good morning. Are you listening? Are you hearing me? Okay. First of all, thank you very much for your presentations. It's always a pleasure to listen to very good research results. So I do congratulate you both, and also the comments made by Cameron. Thank you. I might have actually, to Daniela, I might have perhaps two obvious comments and two questions. But before my obvious comments, I would like to say that I am so happy. I was so happy to hear both of you, because one of the things that I've been working on for such a long time, at least one of the things I've been repeating for so much time, it's how much foreign policy matters domestically. So what we did have to do, what we really had to do was to do more research on how that happens. So I'm very happy to see that researchers are advancing on this direction. Well, my obvious comments to Daniela paper. Well, because I haven't read the paper, I might, made some comments that you have already, mentioned or discussed on the paper. So forgive me for that. Well, but first of all, the first thing is that it seems to be obvious that China has to improve its, propaganda, its positive propaganda abroad, because China government has to develop some mechanism to send its image to actually to improve its image abroad, because there are so many examples, especially at this time during the pandemic. There's so much against Chinese image that it's obvious that China has to do something on the other way around. But anyway, another point is that, as Daniela showed, it seems that foreign policy matters more, or much more, as long as it comes to the people's wallet, as long as it gives some kind of laws. People start to, to cry out against something. Those are obvious comments, but especially the second one, it was time to have someone showing that with evidence, empirical evidence, and I did appreciate that. I'm not sure, Daniela, if I understood what the period of time are you working on, your research? Why I'm asking you that? Because I think the pandemic might have reinforced even further, even more, these negative views on Chinese presence in Brazil, even if there's no direct connection between the business sectors that were, that had losses because of China, you know, trade shocks, negative trade shocks, and the pandemic. I'm sure that the pandemic has really made things much worse, and the comments and the reaction against China much worse than it was in the past. Well, another question is, if you, Daniela, had worked with talking about the legislators, if you're seeing any difference between legislators from different political parties, or if it doesn't matter, as long as they are either from the Workers' Party or PSDB or in DEM or whatever, as long as their constituencies mobilize them in favor of their demands, they get, you know, kind of critical position or a critical stance against the Chinese influence and the Chinese presence in Brazil. Anna, I'm afraid I couldn't listen to your presentation all the time because there was some domestic problems. So I couldn't follow you. So I'm sorry about that. But even so, I'm asking one question that you might have mentioned. So I'm sorry if you did. I didn't listen to you saying anything about robots. I mean, I don't know anything about Twitter. I don't have a Twitter. My son is always complaining with me that I should follow Twitters to, you know, but anyway, I'm resisting for you know, but so because I don't understand anything about Twitter, I don't know if you can really use robots to kind of spread this kind of comments, because I was really, really impressed by the comments made by Ernesto Araújo saying that there was 47,000 comments on foreign policy, blah, 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 on tweeters on foreign policy. I got very, very impressed. Well, and my comment is something that, you know, last year I went to Brasilia to interview some diplomats, and I talked to one diplomat, a very good one. He's in his, I don't know, 50s, so he's in the middle of his career, but he's an ascendant career, and it's a brilliant diplomat. I like him very much, but it was quite embarrassing when he came to me and said, you know, you guys talked so much, asked so much about social participation on Brazilian foreign policy. Now, what did you get? You got that now. So you have to face that social participation might not only comes with positive, might not always be positive for Brazilian foreign policy. So I was I could answer him for hours, but I was very surprised and very embarrassed when he came and he said that, because in a sense, well, that's true. We've been having like these 47,000 tweeters on behalf, in defense of Brazilian foreign policy. Bolsonaro's foreign policy is quite worrying. So that's the only comments I would like to make. And again, thank you very much, and thank you for this panel. It's wonderful. I really would like to see the papers, read the papers or the article when it's published. And thank you.
Thanks a lot, Leticia. Before giving the word for Daniela and Anna, I want to make some few comments also. Daniela, it was very pleased to hear again about your piece. It's very good and it's published. We don't need to talk anymore about that. But I have some thoughts about the research agenda. have you looked for some behavioral data on voting partners or on campaign financing to see if these attitudes about China has an effect on effective policy making, on effective politics? There are candidates that are being winning election or losing election due to China connections, and the voters, they are behaving different on those localities, and I think we have a lot of electoral data to analyze that and to see if there is, in the end of the day, some impact on the real politics, that is, in the way that the Thies was talking about, how in the end of the day, foreign policy imports for the day-by-day politics. And for Anna, I was thinking that when you show the data, sometimes we got that it can, it's, of course, Twitter, it's a universal phenomena, but some political movements are catching it more effectively in Brazil, perhaps, than others. Normally, Bolsonarismo and all the mechanics that worked for the president to be elected. And have you tried to see how the data behaves if you separate who is conforming with the government, who is pro-government, and who also is from the government, and who is sending information, sending evaluations against government? And the second thought that I have, how the events affects the Twitter public sphere. That probably when you are catching some information on important concepts of foreign policy, there would be much less variation and much less movement, and sometimes it happens something. The Brazil have a confrontation with Venezuela in the borders. There is a meeting of Brazil and the BRICS, or the UN speech of Bolsonaro. How the Twitter public sphere behaves when there is no events and there is something important that is happening at that moment. Probably, I think that is a speculation that those people from outside the foreign policy community must speak normally when there is some events. So there is something that people is paying attention, so they will speak about it. That's it. So you give the word for Daniela, please.
Yeah, the issue, I agree, Letícia, that there's some work to be done by China. But at the same time, I don't know, I'm curious to know where this work comes from, the anti-China thing, because it seems to be a big deal. This issue of communism, I have a very hard time believing that anyone believes that it's about being communist. Come on, it's like, right? And so I don't know what exactly China symbolizes to these people who are spreading this anti-China sentiment. I think that the 5G, it seems to me that China has been taking it all and not complaining and not, responding only in very extreme cases. The 5G will be the turning point. If we really create problems for them for the 5G, then I think the response will come. I'd be concerned if I were in the exporting sector, because I think this will be a crucial matter. They have been very pragmatic so far, but this will be a major difference. And again, with all the respect to the American in the room, but like under Trump, is it really China that needs to improve the image? It's really surprising. I think that this process it really deserves more investigation. Yes, and I agree with you, and I like this aspect of the research, that foreign policy matters as long as it matters, like it affects your life, and it can be through jobs, it can be through like immigrants in your city, it can be in many different ways that can affect your life. And I think that the mechanisms through which foreign policy affects people, this is when it really matters. I think people can respond many things, but they only care if there's something that's related to their own well-being, right? The pandemic, we've done this work before the pandemic. I've been thinking about so many possibilities with the pandemic to try to tease the Chinese virus and the Chinese many things that have been going on during the pandemic. I haven't like figured out a nice way to deal with the pandemic and this story, but that definitely has something that should be explored, because it seems that it got much worse. I'm not sure how much worse, because again, if it's only about affecting their own lives, this discourse might not go that far. But I think it's something definitely to be worth studying. And different political parties, we control for parties, and we control for whether the party is in government or not. So whether the PT changed their minds over time, because there are two rounds of the survey, legislative survey, and it doesn't matter much. What happens is, in 2013, legislators on average were more favorable to China than in 2017, suggesting that they felt the inflection of the commodity boom as well. So they on average. But the distinction is really between like those representing and not representing losing areas. Ivan, you're right. Like all these micro foundations, this is what I'm interested in. I suspect that these interests have to be the issue, and it goes back to the story of the pandemic. I'm not sure if the pandemic increased the anti-China sentiment, or if the pandemic opened an opportunity for those who are spreading the anti-China sentiment to reinforce their message. So, but still, like how these things are playing out, and whether it's a coincidence that we have this anti-China sentiment in foreign policy, I don't think it is. How these things are playing out, which are the channels, I still don't know. But for example, in the case of the Supreme Court, when the industrialists went with Bolsonaro, they were asking to open business, and they were asking for protection because China had opened before and was already like spreading their products in the world. This was the discourse, right, that they gave to Toffoli. But now that we figure the relationships, now we want to know how in the details that they work. So that's where we're going for sure.
Anna, please.
All right, thank you for your questions, Ivan, and thank you so much for your questions, Leticia. I'll begin by those. So I'm not sure, something happened here? No, okay, we're good. Sometimes it all goes silent and I don't know what's going on. Well, first of all, robots, and this is a very delicate issue because it's we have been able to recognize more and more the presence of robots, or an authentic behavior, as we call it. I mean, whether it's an actual person being paid to retweet and have an authentic behavior, whether it's a machine, whether it's different types of accounts being monitored by one single person to spread out any given message. So yes, an authentic behavior has been it's a little bit like a cat and mouse chase, as people begin to have the tools to identify an authentic behavior. An authentic behavior changes in a way that it looks more authentic with time. So it's something that has been evolving. It's something that has been taken into consideration in practically every social media. But when you think about Twitter engagement, it is very important to say that if bots are being used, they're being used to make the issue or the tweet or the trending topic outstanding. In the great sea of information, they want to make people see. They want that tweet about Ernesto Araújo or China or whatever to be seen by the most people possible. So this is something that whether it's obviously it changes the landscape, whether actually 700,000 tweets on foreign policy issues in 2 months were actually tweeted by people, or if 10% or 20% of them were tweeted by machines. The thing is, if they were tweeted by machines, obviously the landscape changes, but still someone is interested in foreign policy issues being seen by more and more people, and that says something. So yes, it would need an examination. It's quite hard to do an examination cross themes, but once you get in one single theme and can examine the most engaging profiles and do network analysis, you can estimate a percentage of the debate that wasn't authentic. Still, it may be important to someone to push up foreign policy issues if there is a large participation. So there's something there to be understood. Well, regarding social participation, there's a question that I didn't even touch in this paper, but it's in my mind every day, which is because I focused on themes and not leaders. I captured leaders after crossing by themes, so it was the other way around. But looking at what leaders publish, I actually asked myself whether is this really public diplomacy, because it's probably not. I mean, it's foreign policy being used as a tool. I don't have the, I mean, this is me just answering your question. This is not on the paper. I don't have the, this is not measurable or still not measurable in the work, but you know, to engage people, to say things that might have a high degree of engagement, that might generate animosities, even more than positive reaction, it might generate animosity. So when a leader tweets about China, for instance, saying that he won't support the vaccine, he won't buy a vaccine, first of all, because it was made in China, well, you know, that creates an atmosphere that is foreign policy being made there discursively, but it's there unofficially, but well, it's still, you know, it's not an official channel, but it's still there, and it generates animosities. It generates a lot of buzz in traditional media even, which takes me to Ivan's question. So is this public policy? Is this actual social participation? The degree of concentration of the debate, you know, you having like a few hundred very eloquent message senders and thousands of message replicators. Is this actual social participation? So there, I think this, the expression of attitudes in the internet still has to be understood a little bit better, because it is participation when you get a direct forum. It is participation when you get informed commentary, and it is an indicator of interest when you get many people retweeting it. It's not by no means insignificant. It is very significant, but this relates a lot with the way back that Cameron asked. How do we get that collective kind of diffuse sentiment expressed in a huge cloud of data and transform this into a measurement of opinion, of actual social participation, of activism in a sort of way? So I think this is, I don't think this is public diplomacy. I don't think tweeting about, you know, I don't like this vaccine because it was made in China. This has nothing to do with our conception of what public diplomacy should be. Just to comment very briefly, when as I was monitoring the relationship between Brazil and Israel, one of the hashtags was hashtag Hamas, eu votei no Haddad, meaning Hamas, I voted for Haddad, who was Bolsonaro's opponent in the election. So this happened as Bolsonaro vowed to change Brazil's embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And this created some sort of a conflict with Arabian countries and, you know, the community here in Brazil. So it was something quite outstanding that people would, in a single hashtag, consolidate their notions of domestic policy. They positioned themselves regarding the political spectrum in the country. They condensed their notions of approval or disapproval of a foreign policy measure. And they expressed their notion of international relations in general. I mean, they somehow expressed any sort of interest or knowledge about a Middle East conflict and their actors by explicitly naming one of their actors. So it's a complex phenomenon, and we have a very few elements from which to extract a lot of information. So bots are important. They diminish the capacity of public participation, so things are related. And even to answer more directly to your question, I'm gonna try and be brief. Yes, by looking at the tweets, you can see as the tweets are deeply related to approval or disapproval of a certain foreign policy measure, they necessarily relate to a field or to a place in the domestic political spectrum. So it is very the clouds are really visible. I wish in in the very near future to put those things in a beautiful graph and have you see the nodes and the clouds those communities form, and the sizes they acquire depending on each subject. Twitter, it's in constant dialogue with the public sphere, with traditional media, with events. As we can see in the table, engagement is so much higher when it comes to something that is actually happening in real life. So we got the hashtag in the case of the embassy change during the president's visits to Israel. We got many tweets regarding the United States, and they coincided with presidential visits as well. So yes, there is, for instance, the community, the constant community that talks about the UN, for instance, does not get large from day to night unless something happens. And then it calls up the attention of everybody, and then it hits, and then the wave passes. There is a constant conversation, in a low volume, and then somebody tweets something or something happens in real life, and those things merge a lot. So I guess that's it on my end, unless you want to ask something else.
Thanks a lot, Ana. Thanks a lot, Daniela. I want to finish our table. That was very, very good. We learned a lot. Thanks a lot, Cameron, to give some of your time, the presentations that Daniela made and Ana made, the participation of Feliciano and Leticia. I'm very happy to make this conversation about public opinion foreign policies from the project Brasil, as Américas e o Mundo, that is part from the project Las Américas e el Mundo, that we are compiling data from public opinion and the international relations community from many Latin American countries. And I think that in the next ABC, encontro da ABC, in the next meeting of the ABCP, we should do it out again. Thanks a lot, and to all of you, have a nice weekend and a nice lunch.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much. Thanks, Cameron. Bye,
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Cameron. Thank you, everyone.